As we're listening to our final story, again, we want to thank Gregory's for hosting us tonight. This is a great space. I hear the chicken wings are really good, so I'm looking forward to maybe testing those out. So we have one last teller, and that is Shingi Mavima. I said that wrong after you told me how to say it, but come on up anyway.
She was 80% there. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. Any Zimbabweans? No. And for the first 12 years of my life, I lived in a low-income township in the city of Mutare, what we may colloquially call the ghetto. And while life with my grandparents and the community at large was, for the most part, peaceful and pleasant, we couldn't help but notice that poverty was all around us. We would walk miles upon miles from the time I was 5 to get to school. And this tiny school with 2,000 students in it, tiny facilities and 2,000 students. And we would go to school under trees, while half the school was in buildings. Then at noon we would switch and those guys would come to the trees and we would get into the buildings. We would often have to share textbooks, so maybe 4 to 6 students to a textbook, which itself was already tattered and torn. And when we weren't in school, we would walk miles and miles some more, usually barefoot, because for the most part people had maybe 2 or 3 good pairs of shoes, one of them which was the school shoes, and one for when we would go to the city. So this was life in Mutare. Then at 12, my grandmother passed away. My mother came back from college, and I ended up moving to a private school in Harare, which is the capital city, and this was a suburban community. Now, this was as foreign as one place can be from my primary school, right? Instead of going to school under trees, we had huge fields and science and computer labs. Nobody walked to school at this school. 90% of the 800 students either drove themselves or were dropped off by drivers or their parents, while the other 10% lived at the school because there was a boarding school as well. 50% of the school was white students who are descendants of the colonial settlers. And up to that point, I had never had a personal encounter with a white person before. And even the African students, the black students who went to this school but had grown up in these communities, spoke with a thick British accent and often mispronounced their own Shona names in doing so, right? So this was even the president's son went there. What I'm saying is this school was amazing on that level. I often say that I'm often asked how much of a cultural shock I had when I came to the US to start undergraduate in Grand Valley, in Grand Rapids. And I often say that the culture shock of moving from that suburban community in Zimbabwe to suburban US was far less a culture shock than moving between those two schools in Zimbabwe. Now, as children, and frankly as people do, I was subject to some bullying when I got to this school. I was unsophisticated. I spoke English with a thick Shona accent as opposed to the other way around. I did not have the right gear for cricket. I lived in a studio apartment with my mom, right? And as children, and frankly as people do, I began to act up, lashing out to fit in. I wanted to be cool. So I developed this disciplinary record with grades to match. And I remember one would be the 10th grade here, Form 3, we were headed for Easter vacation, and the last thing that I did was I got kicked out of class for being disruptive, and as I walked out, I banged on the lockers, right, just to make a scene. So I left that term with a suspension notice. I wasn't suspended, but with a notice for suspension. And I was also bottom of my class with a failing average. And you know, I hid that report card from my poor mom. Now, so we go on this Easter break, and with my school trouble sort of behind me, I was enjoying the holidays. I was enjoying the vacation. And on this day, I woke up excited because it was the day of the Kotko Rugby Festival, which is the premier event for the preppy and wannabe preppy students in Harare. It's big time. Everybody was going to be there. I picked out my outfit, and I was going to be looking good, and I couldn't wait to hit the streets with my cousins. So I hop on my bicycle and start riding it to where they were, excited. Then as I'm crossing this Lomagundi Street, which was the major street, I got hit. See, I say it like that because I don't actually remember it happening. But I guess it happened because I have these scars. And I woke up 4 hours later in the hospital. I heard that a speeding car had hit the back part of my bicycle, and I spun around and was knocked out for 4 hours. And I woke up, and I remember, which is crazy because I don't even really like orange juice, but I remember the first thing I said when I woke up is like, can I have some orange juice? I remember the nurse who unbandaged me for the first time since the scene, screaming when she saw the wound on the underside of my leg. Which, if you don't want your nurses screaming when they see you. Counting at least 80 different people who came to see me while I was in hospital. Even my grandfather, who notoriously never leaves his home, he's a retired nurse, so he drove to Harare and stayed with me for 2 weeks just tending to me. That was one. The second thing I remember was nobody from my high school came. So here I am doing this song and dance to fit in and look cool to these people, and they did not even notice that I was gone. And the third thing that happened is I lived through the speeding bike and the screaming nurses and the scarred faces, and I had lived. Me, the unsophisticated kid in the big city, the no-name boy who shares classrooms with the president's son. I had lived. Now, it may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but to a few people it did. So I went back to school that year with a renewed attitude, with a renewed orientation. I knew who it was that I had to impress. So, a lot has happened since then, right? So I'm going to fast forward to two important things that bring me to this stage here. The first one is this. In May of this year, I graduate from MSU with my PhD in African American and African Studies. Which is not too shabby for somebody who was bottom of his class at that point. The second thing is, as my life has shifted a certain way, I've given my life to sharing these experiences with other children who may be in the same places that I've been in. I've worked in refugee services. I work with the My Brother's Keeper program in Detroit with middle school children. And over here, I coach an immigrant soccer team, middle school students. Then I've also founded an organization that helps send kids in my old community back in Mutare to school in Zimbabwe. And in all this, I always finish off my little inspirational speeches with this almost tacky, he told me not to say that, but I insist, tagline about second chances, which is, you don't need to break your bones like I did to get the breakthrough that I did. Thank you.